Edmund Blackstone believed he was buying a ghost ranch, a forgotten slice of Wyoming dirt, stained by failure and death, a place where the previous owner had died alone, with no family to claim his legacy. For a man like Edmund, a man who built his empire on the bones of other people's misfortune, it was the perfect deal. He was a collector of broken things, land, businesses, people, all raw materials for the vast machine of his wealth. The telegram in his hand was crisp, simple, and cold, just like every other transaction that had made him the most feared man west of the Mississippi. Riverside Ranch available. Previous owner deceased. Price negotiable. He was on a train hurtling through the empty plains of 1885, a king surveying a kingdom he'd conquered not with a sword, but with a ledger. Every mile of track, every puff of steam was a testament to his power. But he had no idea, not a single clue, that he wasn't riding toward a simple land deal. He was riding toward a reckoning. He thought he was buying a dead man's ranch. He was about to find out he was buying back his own soul, piece by painful piece. Because on that ranch in the dilapidated house where a good man had died, there were secrets waiting for him. 53 of them, to be exact. And every single one of them had his name written on their heart. The train groaned into the station at Dusty Creek, a town that looked like it had given up years ago. The wind howled a lonely tune through the cracked facades of the buildings, and dust devils danced in the street like bored ghosts. Edmund stepped onto the platform, his polished leather boots a stark contrast to the splintered, sun-bleached wood. He was a man of the city, of tailored suits and cold, hard cash, and this place was a raw, open wound on the face of the frontier. A weaselly man in a rumpled suit scurried toward him, his hand outstretched and a smile plastered on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Blackstone, I'm Henderson, the land agent. An honor, sir, a true honor." Edmund's handshake was an act of dismissal, firm and brief. He didn't do pleasantries. Time was money, and he was already calculating how much this little excursion was costing him. "Henderson, the property, let's go." Henderson's smile faltered for a second. "Right this way, sir. Got a wagon waiting." The buckboard was as tired as the horses pulling it. As they rattled out of town, Henderson started talking, his voice a nervous buzz. "Now I should mention, the ranch, it's been empty a while. 6 months, maybe more, since old Pete Morrison passed. Pneumonia took him last winter. Sad business. No family to speak of." Edmund wasn't listening. He was scanning the land, his eyes dissecting the landscape into assets and liabilities. The grazing was decent. The creek provided a steady water source. But more importantly, this parcel connected two of his largest cattle operations. Buying this ranch wasn't just an acquisition. It was an act of consolidation, turning 3 separate properties into one massive, unbroken empire of Blackstone land. It would triple their value overnight. "What about the livestock?" Edmund grunted, noticing the empty fields. "Sold off," Henderson said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice over the side of the wagon. "Paid off his debts. Pete, God rest his soul, wasn't much for business. A soft touch, if you catch my meaning. Always helping folks out, but never watched his own pockets." Henderson chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "But that's good news for you, Mr. Blackstone. You're getting the land for a song." The setting sun bled across the sky as they crested a hill, and Edmund saw it for the first time. Riverside Ranch. It was nestled in a valley, a solid 2-story house of stone and timber, surrounded by a barn, a bunkhouse, and a few other outbuildings. It was neglected, yes, but it had been built with care. It had good bones. But as his eyes adjusted to the fading light, he saw something that made him sit bolt upright. Something impossible. A thin gray wisp of smoke was curling from the chimney of the main house. Edmund turned his cold gaze on Henderson. "You told me the property was abandoned." Henderson fidgeted, refusing to meet his eye. "Well, sir, technically, it is." "Then explain the smoke, Henderson." The land agent swallowed hard. "Might be squatters, sir. Drifters. You know how it is. Folks hear a place is empty." Edmund's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped. He'd dealt with squatters before. Desperate families clinging to a piece of land that wasn't theirs. It was an ugly business, but a necessary one. How many? Henderson shrugged, looking anywhere but at Edmund. Hard to say, sir. A few, maybe. The folks in town, they're a bit tight-lipped about what goes on out at the old Morrison place. As they drew closer, the signs of life became undeniable. The windows were clean. The porch had been swept. There were even wildflowers planted in wooden boxes along the railing. This wasn't the work of drifters just passing through. This was a home. The wagon ground to a halt. Edmund's mind was racing. This was a complication, an unexpected variable in his perfect calculation. It was an annoyance he would have to erase. "Wait here," he commanded Henderson, swinging down from the wagon. "No, on second thought, go back to town. I'll handle this myself." Henderson looked relieved and terrified at the same time. "Are you sure, Mr. Blackstone? They could be dangerous." Edmund's hand instinctively went to the cold steel of the Colt revolver hidden beneath his coat. "I've been handling dangerous men my entire life, Henderson. Go." As the wagon rattled away, leaving him alone in the twilight, Edmund felt a strange sense of calm. This was his world. Confrontation, negotiation from a position of absolute power. He walked up the porch steps, the sound of his boots loud and deliberate in the quiet air. He could hear faint voices from inside now, a low murmur he couldn't quite make out. He raised his fist and knocked on the solid oak door, a series of sharp, authoritative raps that echoed like gunshots. The voices inside stopped instantly. The silence that followed was thick with tension. He heard footsteps, light and cautious, approaching the door. A lock scraped, and the door opened a tiny crack. A single brown eye, wide with fear and suspicion, peered out at him. It belonged to a boy, no older than 15. His hair was a mess, his clothes were patched, but he held himself with a strange, defiant stillness. "We ain't hurting nobody, mister," the boy said, his voice trying for a strength it didn't quite have. "We keep to ourselves." Edmund looked down at the boy, a flicker of something, annoyance? Pity? Crossing his mind. It didn't matter. This was business. "I am Edmund Blackstone," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I own this land now." The boy's eye widened, the fear replaced by something else. Recognition. "You're, the cattle baron?" "Among other things," Edmund said. He was enjoying this now. The way the boy's world was crumbling with a few simple words. This was the moment he always relished, the moment his power became real. "What is your name, son?" The boy hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. He pulled the door open a little wider. Charlie Wells." "Well, Charlie Wells, you and whoever else is in this house are trespassing on my property. You have 24 hours to vacate." Charlie didn't flinch. He just stood there, his jaw set. "Look, Mr. Blackstone, we know we don't have a legal right, but we got nowhere else to go. We've been looking after the place. We haven't done any harm." "We?" Edmund pressed, his eyes narrowing. "Who is we?" For the first time, the boy looked uncertain. He glanced back over his shoulder into the dim light of the house. Then he turned back, took a deep breath, and opened the door all the way. Maybe you better just come see for yourself." Edmund stepped over the threshold, his hand still resting near his gun, expecting to see a handful of ragged drifters. But what he saw stopped him cold. The air left his lungs. His mind, usually so quick and calculating, went completely blank. The main room of the house wasn't filled with vagrants. It was filled with children, dozens and dozens of them. They were everywhere, sitting on the floor, perched on handmade furniture, huddled in corners. Children of all ages, from toddlers to teenagers, all staring at him with the same wide, silent eyes. This wasn't a squatter camp. It was an orphanage. Edmund stood frozen in the doorway, the hardened businessman completely unprepared for the scene before him. The room was clean, impossibly so. A warm fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a gentle glow on the small faces that tracked his every move. There were drawings pinned to the walls, childish and colorful. The air smelled of wood smoke and stew. This place, which he had bought as a cold asset, pulsed with a quiet, orderly life that defied all logic. He turned to the boy, Charlie, his voice barely a whisper. "How many?" Charlie moved to stand between Edmund and the smallest children, a young shepherd protecting his flock. 53, including me. 53. The number was staggering. It was an impossibility. How could so many children be living here, alone, in the middle of nowhere? Where did you all come from? He demanded, his mind struggling to process the information, to fit it into a neat column in his mental ledger. An older girl, maybe 16, with dark braided hair and eyes that held an old soul's weariness, stood up. All over, sir. Most of us, we don't have parents anymore. This is Annie, Charlie said, his voice low. She helps me run things. Aunt Annie gave a slight formal nod, her expression unreadable. We know you'll want us gone, Mr. Blackstone. We've heard the stories about you, but if you could just give us a few days. Some of these kids are so little. We just need time. Edmund's gaze swept the room again. He saw a little girl with bright red curls clutching a handmade doll. He saw two young boys sharing a worn book by the firelight. He saw a teenage boy patiently rocking a baby wrapped in a tattered blanket. They were thin, yes, and their clothes were a patchwork of repairs, but they weren't starving, they weren't broken. There was a resilience here, a quiet dignity that was almost unnerving. Who feeds you? He asked, the question sounding absurd even to his own ears. Charlie and Annie exchanged a look, a silent communication that spoke of shared burdens and long-held secrets. We manage, Charlie said carefully. The older ones, we find work in town. Chopping wood, helping at the general store, whatever we can get. We have a garden out back. Some of the townsfolk help out when they can spare it. And we look after each other, Annie added, her voice firm. It's what Pete taught us. Pete, the dead man, the soft-hearted rancher who'd let his business fail. Edmund was beginning to suspect there was more to Pete Morrison's story than Henderson had let on. A small girl, the one with the red curls, had detached herself from the group and was slowly creeping toward him. She stopped a few feet away, her head tilted, studying him with the unflinching curiosity of a child. Are you the man who's going to make us leave? She asked, her voice small but clear. The question hung in the air, a simple, brutal truth. He was. Of course he was. This was a business transaction. These children were a liability, a complication to be removed. But as he looked down at her freckled face, at the 52 other faces watching him, the cold certainty he'd felt just moments before began to crack. For the first time in 30 years, Edmund Blackstone didn't know what to do. He crouched down, an unfamiliar and awkward motion for a man who spent his life looking down on others. What's your name? He asked the little girl, his voice softer than he intended. Lucy, she whispered. Lucy May. Well, Lucy May, he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. I think we have some things to discuss. He straightened up and looked at Charlie. The boy hadn't relaxed his protective stance. You've been in charge here? Since Pete died? Charlie nodded. He made me promise. Said I was the oldest boy, that it was my job to look after everyone. My responsibility. The boy's voice trembled on the last word. The immense weight of that promise suddenly laid bare. In that moment, Edmund saw a ghost of himself in the boy, the same fierce determination, the same old-before-his-time gravity. But where life had forged Edmund into something hard and sharp, this boy seemed to be made of something else entirely, something stronger. Show me the rest of this place, Edmund commanded, needing to see, to understand the mechanics of this impossible society. Charlie led him on a tour, and what Edmund saw defied belief. The bunkhouse had been turned into immaculate dormitories, beds made with military precision. The kitchen was a marvel of efficiency, with food stores neatly labeled and organized, a complex meal rota pinned to the wall. This wasn't just survival, it was a functioning, thriving community, built by children and run on rules of mutual respect and shared labor. They ended the tour in what had been Pete Morrison's office, and it was there that the first real crack appeared in Edmund Blackstone's world. The walls were covered in photographs, dozens of them, portraits of children, faded and worn, each one a silent story. Pete kept a picture of every child who ever stayed here. Charlie explained, his voice full of reverence. He said it was important that they be remembered, that they weren't invisible. Edmund scanned the faces, a sea of lost children. But then his eyes snagged on one particular photograph, an old daguerreotype sitting in a place of honor on the desk. It showed a young, tired-looking man in work clothes, his arm around a woman holding a swaddled baby. There was something hauntingly familiar about the man's face, a ghost from a past Edmund had long since buried. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice tight. "Don't rightly know, sir," Charlie said. "Pete never said, just kept it on his desk. Said it reminded him why he started all this." A cold dread, slick and oily, began to seep into Edmund's bones. He felt a sudden, desperate need to know more. Did Morrison keep records? Papers? Anything about where these children came from? Charlie nodded, pulling a heavy wooden box from under the desk. He wrote everything down. Names, dates, why they came here. Pete was very particular about the details. Edmund's hands were shaking as he lifted the lid. He didn't know why. He just knew with a certainty that chilled him to the core that he was about to open a box of ghosts, and they were all going to be his. Inside the box were stacks of paper filled with Pete Morrison's neat, careful handwriting, ledgers, letters, and personal histories. Edmund picked up the first file. It was a record of two young brothers, orphaned when their father, a laborer, was killed during the construction of a new railway line. As Edmund read the details, his blood ran cold. The railway line belonged to the Union Pacific, a company in which he was a majority shareholder. He pushed the thought aside. A coincidence. He picked up another file, a girl named Sarah whose father had died in a boiler explosion at a lumber mill. Edmund's stomach tightened. He owned that mill. He remembered the accident. He'd signed a paltry compensation check and never thought of it again. His hands trembled as he dug deeper into the box. File after file, story after tragic story, and one name appeared over and over and over again. A damning indictment scrawled in the dead man's ink. Blackstone Mining, Blackstone Cattle Corporation, Blackstone Land Development, Blackstone, Blackstone, Blackstone. It was a graveyard of his own making, a mine collapse in the Bighorn Mountains. 15 men dead, leaving 23 children behind. A cattle stampede during a blizzard in Montana, 12 cowboys lost, orphaning 18 kids. A factory fire in Denver, 10 workers killed, 31 children left with nothing. Accidents he had dismissed as the cost of business. Safety measures he had refused to implement because they would cut into his profits. Men he had considered expendable cogs in his vast money-making machine. They weren't just numbers in a ledger anymore. They were the faces on the wall. They were the children in the other room. He sank into Pete Morrison's chair, the wooden box open on his lap like a tomb. The air was thick and heavy, and he couldn't breathe. These 53 children weren't just squatters. They were his orphans, the living, breathing collateral damage of his relentless ambition. Pete Morrison hadn't just been running an orphanage. He had been cleaning up Edmund's messes, quietly gathering the human debris left in the wake of his empire. "Mr. Blackstone," Charlie's voice cut through the haze of his horror. "Sir, are you okay?" Edmund looked up at the boy, truly seeing him for the first time. The defiant chin, the steady eyes, that same unsettling flicker of familiarity. "Your last name," Edmund croaked, his throat dry. "You said it was Wells." "Yes, sir. Charlie Wells." With a shaking hand, Edmund sifted through the files until he found the one he was now desperately searching for. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, an accident report stapled to a death certificate. "Your father, was his name Marcus Wells?" Charlie's eyes widened in shock. "Yes. How did you know?" Edmund couldn't speak. He just stared at the paper in his hand. Marcus Wells, age 34, deceased. Cause of death, tunnel collapse, Blackwater Mine 7. Employer, Blackstone Silver Mining Corporation. At the bottom of the report, a final, chilling note. Family compensation paid, $50, $50. He had paid $50 for this boy's father, for his entire world. Edmund finally looked up from the paper and met the boy's gaze. He didn't need to say a word. The truth was a gaping chasm between them. Charlie's face, a mask of youthful bravado just moments before, slowly hardened with a terrible dawning comprehension. "It was your mine," the boy said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "The mine where my pa died. It was yours." Edmund could only manage a slight, pathetic nod. The boy's gaze drifted past him toward the main room where the other children were waiting. "And them?" Charlie asked, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "All the others? They're folks. They all worked for you, didn't they?" I I didn't know," Edmund stammered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. How could he not have known? He had known. He had just chosen not to see, not to care. He had built a fortress of wealth and power around himself, so high that he could no longer see the bodies it was built upon. Charlie stared at him, this powerful, wealthy man who had just been shattered by a box of old papers. The boy didn't shout. He didn't cry. He just spoke, with a wisdom that was ancient and terrifying. "Pete used to say that people don't always mean to do bad things. He said the real test of a man is what he does after he finds out." The simple, profound words of a dead man, spoken by the son of another man he'd killed, struck Edmund with the force of a physical blow. He, Edmund Blackstone, the titan of industry, the man who bent the will of senators and governors, was being judged by a 15-year-old boy in a dead man's office, and he was being found wanting. What do you want from me?" Edmund asked, the question surrendering all of his power, all of his authority. It was the plea of a guilty man before his accuser. Charlie's gaze was unwavering. "I want you to let us stay," he said, his voice regaining some of its earlier strength. "Just for a while, until we can figure something else out. They're just kids, Mr. Blackstone. They don't understand about land deeds and property rights. They just know this is the only home they have." Edmund's eyes were drawn back to the daguerreotype on the desk. Marcus Wells. He remembered him now. A quiet, diligent worker. A man who always tipped his hat and had a shy smile. He'd seen him at a company picnic once, years ago, proudly holding his infant son. This boy, Charlie. Edmund had shaken his hand, praised his work ethic, and then sent him into a mine he knew was unsafe because reinforcing the tunnels would have cost a week's profit. The weight of it all was suffocating. He felt a desperate need for air, for time. "I need to think," he said, his voice ragged. Charlie nodded, a flicker of something. Pity? Understanding? In his eyes. "You can use Pete's room upstairs, if you want to stay the night. Annie's made stew. There's always enough for one more." The offer of hospitality, of a place at their table, was a kindness so profound it felt like a punishment. He was their monster, the architect of their misery, and they were offering him a bowl of stew. As Charlie left the office to rejoin his flock, Edmund remained in the chair, a prisoner in a room of his own ghosts. He picked up the old photograph of the Wells family. Marcus, his wife Mary, and the baby Charlie. And then he saw it, a detail he'd missed before. In the blurry background of the photograph, partially obscured by a tree, was another figure, a man in a tailored suit, laughing with a group of investors. A younger man, his hair still dark, his face not yet carved into the harsh mask of relentless ambition. It was him. He was in the photograph. He had been standing just yards away from the family whose life he would one day shatter, completely oblivious, completely indifferent. He had been a ghost at their happiest moments, long before he made them ghosts themselves. That night, sleep offered no escape. He lay in Pete Morrison's simple bed, the unfamiliar silence of the prairie pressing in on him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces from the photographs. He saw Marcus Wells tipping his hat. He saw the cold, hard numbers in his profit and loss statements, each one now representing a human life extinguished. He rose before the sun, driven from the bed by his own conscience, and went downstairs. He expected a sleeping house, but the kitchen was already a hive of quiet activity. Annie and two other older girls were moving with a practiced, efficient grace, preparing a breakfast massive enough to feed a small army. The smell of baking bread and frying bacon filled the air. "Morning, Mr. Blackstone," Annie said without looking up from the enormous pot of oatmeal she was stirring. "Coffee's on the stove." He poured a cup, his hands still unsteady, and watched them. They worked with a silent, seamless coordination that would have been the envy of any of his factory foremen. This was more than just a routine. It was a ritual of survival and care. "How long have you been up?" he asked Annie. "Since 4:30, she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "Have to get breakfast made and the chores started before the little ones wake up." She finally looked at him, her eyes clear and direct, holding a maturity that was jarring in a 16-year-old. "Charlie's already out with the chickens." Edmund looked through the window and saw the boy, a silhouette against the pale dawn, moving with a tireless energy that seemed to power the entire ranch. He turned back to Annie, a question forming on his lips before he could stop it. "Annie, your parents?" He needed to know. He had to see the full scope of the damage he had wrought. Her stirring slowed for a fraction of a second. "Mine cave-in," she said, her voice perfectly even. "Near Cheyenne. My pa died in the collapse, with 5 other men." She held his gaze, her dark eyes pinning him in place. "Blackstone Silver Mine, in case you were wondering." The name hit him like another blow to the chest. He remembered the Cheyenne collapse. A support timber had failed. His engineers had warned him that the sourcing company was using substandard wood to cut costs. He had ignored the warnings. It was cheaper. He had traded 6 lives for a few $100s. Annie's father was one of them. "How did you get here?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Pete found me," she said, her focus returning to the oatmeal. "Found me and my baby brother on the road to Dusty Creek, half-starved. My brother, he didn't make it through the winter." She said it without a trace of self-pity, a simple statement of a brutal fact. But for a fleeting moment, he saw a flicker of the 14-year-old girl who had held her dying brother in her arms. "Pete brought me here, gave me a home, a purpose." She lifted the heavy pot from the stove as if it weighed nothing. "Someone has to look after the kids. They just keep showing up." Over breakfast, seated amongst the quiet hum of 53 children eating, Edmund learned the full story. He listened as Charlie and Annie explained their intricate system. The older children worked in town, pooling every cent. They ran a small farm, tended a herd of dairy cows Pete had left them. They had a school, for God's sake, in one of the old outbuildings where Annie and the other older girls taught the younger children how to read and write, using books Pete had collected over a lifetime. It was a self-sustaining world built from scraps, held together by sheer willpower and a fierce, protective love. After the meal, as the children scattered to their chores, Edmund found Charlie alone, mending a fence line. The boy worked with a steady, rhythmic motion, his focus absolute. "Charlie," Edmund began, "I found something else in Pete's files. A letter. He wrote it to my corporate headquarters in Denver. 4 times. Charlie stopped working, leaning on the post driver. "He wrote a lot of letters." Edmund pulled the folded paper from his pocket. He read it aloud, the words a testament to a quiet, persistent decency he had never known. Pete had calmly and respectfully informed the Blackstone Corporation of the orphans in his care, children of their fallen workers. He hadn't demanded money. He had simply suggested that the company might want to acknowledge the human cost of their operations, perhaps establish a fund to support the families. He had asked for a dialogue. He had appealed to their conscience. "Did he ever get a reply?" Charlie asked, though he already knew the answer. "No," Edmund said, his voice heavy with shame. "He never received a single response. We ignored him." Charlie looked out across the valley at the ranch that was his entire world. "Pete wasn't surprised. He didn't expect you to help. He just thought you had a right to know. He thought it was the right thing to do." The right thing to do. The phrase echoed in Edmund's mind. When was the last time he had done something simply because it was the right thing to do, without first calculating the profit? He couldn't remember. He spent the rest of the day in a daze, a spectator in this world he had inadvertently created. He watched Annie patiently teach a little boy his letters in the makeshift schoolhouse. He watched Charlie calmly settle a dispute between 2 older boys over a shared tool. He saw a community that functioned with more grace and compassion than any city, any corporation, any church he had ever known. That evening, as dinner was being served, little Lucy May, The girl with the red curls came and sat beside him. She chattered away about her day, about the kitten she'd found in the barn, and the songs she had learned in school. Her simple, innocent presence was a stark contrast to the storm of guilt and confusion raging inside him. Then in the middle of dessert, she turned to him, her expression serious. "Mr. Blackstone," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "Charlie says you might be God. He says you're the one who decides if we live or die. Is that true?" The question, in its brutal, childish honesty, struck the air out of the room. 53 pairs of eyes turned to him, waiting. In that moment, he wasn't a cattle baron or a mining magnate. He was something far more terrible. He was the man who held the fate of all these lost children in his hands. He was their creator, and if he chose, their destroyer. The weight of their collective gaze was immense. He looked at Lucy May, her face earnest and unafraid, and then at Charlie and Annie, who watched him with a mixture of hope and hardened resignation. These children had already endured the worst the world could throw at them. They were prepared for another blow. But for the first time, Edmund Blackstone didn't want to be the one to deliver it. He thought of Pete Morrison's unanswered letters, of the quiet dignity of a man who fought a silent war on behalf of forgotten children. He thought of Marcus Wells, a good man dead for $50. He thought of the empire he had built, a towering monument to his own greed, and he felt a profound, soul-deep sickness. What was it all for? What legacy would he leave behind but a trail of broken families and unmarked graves? That night he sat with Charlie and Annie by the dying embers of the fire. The house was finally quiet, the children asleep in their beds. "Tomorrow," Edmund began, his voice low but firm, "I will be sending a series of telegrams. I'm going to make some arrangements." Annie's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What kind of arrangements?" "First," he said, looking from her to Charlie, "this ranch will be placed into a legally binding trust. Its sole purpose will be the care and education of the children who live here and any others who may need it in the future. It will be funded in perpetuity. You will never have to worry about money again." They stared at him, stunned into silence. He continued, the plan forming in his mind with the same clarity and precision he usually reserved for hostile takeovers. "Second, this will become a proper school. I will hire the best teachers in the territory. We will build a library, workshops, whatever you need. Every child here will receive an education that will give them a chance at any future they choose." Charlie finally found his voice. "Why? Why would you do all this?" "Because," Edmund said, the truth of it settling over him with a strange sense of peace, "your fathers and mothers built my fortune. They paid for it with their labor, and in many cases, with their lives. This is not charity. It is a debt that is long overdue." He saw the walls of their suspicion begin to crumble, replaced by a fragile, cautious hope. He knew he had a long road ahead to earn their trust, to truly atone for the sins of his past. But as he looked at these two remarkable young people who had carried an impossible burden with such grace, he knew it was the only work that mattered anymore. He had come to Dusty Creek to acquire a piece of land. He had stumbled upon the ruins of his own humanity, and in the heart of that ruin, tended by the very children he had orphaned, he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for, a chance at redemption. The next morning he rode back to town, but he was not the same man who had arrived 2 days earlier. He didn't see assets and liabilities anymore. He saw a community to be built, a future to be secured. He sent the telegrams that would set the wheels of his vast financial empire in motion, not for acquisition, but for restoration. He was no longer building the Blackstone Empire. He was building the Morrison legacy. He was finally answering Pete's letters. 5 years passed. The Wyoming wind still swept across the plains, but it now whispered through the halls of a place transformed. The Morrison Blackstone Educational Ranch, as it was now known, was an oasis of learning and hope on the frontier. The original ranch house stood at its heart, but it was now surrounded by new dormitories, a state-of-the-art schoolhouse, a bustling library, and workshops filled with the sounds of creation. Edmund Blackstone, now a man in his late 50s with more silver in his hair, walked the grounds not as a landlord, but as a guardian. His days were no longer filled with stock tickers and land deeds, but with school budgets, lesson plans, and letters from graduates. A young man of 20, tall and confident, fell into step beside him. It was Charlie Wells. He had refused Edmund's offer to send him to a university back east, choosing instead to stay and serve as the ranch's superintendent, a bridge between the faculty and the ever-growing student body. "Morning, Mr. Blackstone," Charlie said, his voice holding the easy authority of a natural leader. "The new arrivals from the mining camps near Rock Springs are all settled in. Annie's with them now. Brings our total to 87. Edmund smiled. 87 children, all of them given a future that had been stolen from their parents. "And the graduates?" 15 are in college on full scholarships," Charlie recited from memory. "Another 24 have started their own homesteads or businesses with loans from the trust. Michael Torres just passed the bar exam in California. His first case? Suing a mining company for unsafe working conditions." The irony was not lost on Edmund. He had created his own accountability. The children of the men he had let die were now becoming the lawyers, doctors, engineers, and teachers who would ensure no other man could build an empire the way he had. They paused by a simple stone monument at the center of the campus, inscribed with the names of the parents whose lives had been lost. At the top was a dedication to Pete Morrison. "He taught us that love is the only thing that builds a home." "A letter came for you," Charlie said, handing him an envelope. "From Boston." It was from Lucy May. The little girl with the red curls was now a top student at a prestigious women's college, studying to become a doctor. "I've decided on my specialty," she wrote. "I'm coming back home when I'm done. The ranch and all the towns around it, they need a doctor who understands them, who knows what it's like to come from nothing." Tears welled in Edmund's eyes as he folded the letter. This was his true fortune, not the gold pulled from his mines or the cattle bearing his brand, but the lives these children were building. A journalist once asked him what had prompted his dramatic transformation from a ruthless robber baron to a celebrated philanthropist. Edmund had thought for a long moment, the memories of that first night at the ranch still vivid in his mind. He remembered the 53 pairs of eyes, the crushing weight of his own guilt, and the simple, profound wisdom of a 15-year-old boy. "I spent my life believing that time is money," Edmund told the journalist. "But a boy whose father I had wronged taught me a more valuable lesson." "What was that?" the journalist asked. Edmund looked out at the children playing in the schoolyard, their laughter echoing across the prairie. "He taught me that time is a chance to undo a wrong, a chance to build something that lasts, a chance to pay a debt. I am simply paying my debt." He had arrived at Riverside Ranch a wealthy man, but he had been spiritually bankrupt. The children he found there, the ghosts of his past, had given him a gift beyond measure. They had taken his money, his guilt, and his power, and they had transformed it all into a legacy of hope. They had saved him from himself. This story is a powerful reminder that our choices have ripples we can't always see, and that redemption is possible, even for the most hardened of hearts. It shows that the greatest legacy isn't what we build for ourselves, but what we help others build for their future. What do you think? Could you forgive someone like Edmund Blackstone? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you were moved by this story of transformation and hope on the American frontier, please make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support is what allows us to keep finding and sharing these incredible tales. We have so many more stories to tell, and we can't wait to share them with you. Until next time, stay safe, and remember that it's never too late to do the right thing.